my course was canceled, Culture in America, after a brouhaha over an inadvertent quoting of the word nigga. I was
John, I have to interrupt you briefly.
Yeah.
Glenn, you realize that the word he just used, quite unjustifiably, is going to be considered the most interesting thing about this entire goddamn conversation. What is our policy on that here? Because, we're going to hear about that.
Within context and without any invidious intent, I mean, if the word is appropriate to the communication that is trying to be engaged in, and it was in that case, because the word had quotation marks around it when he spoke it. He was referring to the word. He wasn't using the word. If you see what I mean.
That, and I stand by that too.
It can't be that he cannot refer to a word because he's white.
And I heartily agree.
That's nuts.
It's insane, and we are not going to pretend that isn't true. So I just want it to be clear, given the response. So continue, John.
I mean, what are the stakes when a grizzled old white guy like you, excuse me, but who has deep insight into the kind of socio-cultural matrix that you're trying to get students, to be aware of, runs afoul of the sensibility of the 19-year-olds who have feelings about the way that you deal with these issues.
And the 19-year-olds are supported by people much older than them who are set to support them in the way they handle their feelings.
It's not a counseling session. The enterprise is not therapeutic.
So there was, after I made the quote, the first student who spoke was an African-American who said, yes, I get it. Eminem gets to redefine the identity that matters as those who've struggled. Because he turns on another Black interlocutor and says his name is Clarence, his parents have a real good marriage, and he went to a private school. He wins over the African-American audience. And
this was in 8 Mile.
In 8 Mile. So that's the scene I'm quoting to make the point about the fluidity of identities and how you can start with a default identity that you're Black or you're white and then discover the humanity. So the first African-American had no trouble. The second person was an Afro-Latina who said, that's how it was in my Washington Heights high school. There were 3 whites left in the school and we thought they were from Mars. And we got to know them and realized they were like us. And the third student said, Professor, that's racist. And so I said, I won't, to the person I really admire, you challenging me, that is what free speech and academic liberal arts education should be about. And anybody who wants to continue the talk, come meet with me. And so 3 students stayed afterwards. And I said, I can continue this as long as you want. And I care about this so much. They went immediately to the chair of my department. The chair said, you have a right to feel safe in the classroom. You should go to the provost and go. So you've got 3 students in a lecture class of 40 who've got this illiberal sentiment, or maybe one felt actually wounded. I don't think the other 2 did, but that couldn't have gotten through the gauntlet of organizational life if someone had sat down, the adults, and said, I understand these are difficult issues. I know Professor Rieder, he's cared about race and racism his whole life. You should go talk to him. Continue the. And so I said later to the chair, did you ever think to tell the students, why don't you come talk to Rieder? She said, I wouldn't do that. I told them to go to the grievance people because they have a right to feel safe.
This definition of safe is always interesting because nobody would have used it that way even, I think, as recently as 15 years ago. And the idea is that you've suffered this kind of trauma. And so there's this evolving definition of trauma. And it's not illogical or immoral or silly in itself to extend the definition of trauma. There are things that one is expected to think of as trauma today that back in the day you were expected to just get over. So, for example, date rape. I don't think that it's wrong that we have come to define that as trauma rather than a woman saying, I was out with this guy who was all hands. That's progress. But the question is whether it's progress to say that it's trauma for the N-word to be referred to by a white man in a classroom. And I think that we're being strong-armed into pretending to think that that makes sense by this cadre of people, where the power that they have is that if you call them on the triviality and theatricality of this, you're called a dirty name in wide open spaces. And if possible, your courses are taken away from you. You might even lose your job. Most people aren't up for that. But this really needs to stop. I mean, safety is one thing. Morality and manners change. But here, I frankly think that you were being bullied by people in the name of a spiky and fragile ideology. And what allowed that to happen to you mostly was spectators cowering in fear. And that is not the way things are supposed to be.
I don't make an analogy between the threats of political correctness and social justice warriors and white supremacists on the right. But here's the parallel. The guardrail, we discovered how fragile guardrails of democracy are because we assume civic culture, American exceptionalism leads to progressive historiography will have a democracy. And then it turns out Trump says, oh, let's try this. And then it turns out the guardrails of democracy are tissue paper and not concrete. The same is true of the guardrails of liberal arts education. We see how quickly under this new ideology, colleges and universities concerned with branding, their fear of being told you're not good on diversity issues can lead to the unraveling of important values of free speech. And I think it really hurts what real diversity is.